Hello, everyone. I'm very excited for this conversation featuring the team from Psygen. We've talked a lot about different molecules and treatments, but we haven't talked much about how we get these materials where they need to be. And so we're going to have this group talking about the supply chain challenges and opportunities for psychedelics. With that, let me introduce Crystal Carson, who's going to kick it off and introduce her panel. Hi, Crystal.
Hi, Marnie. Thanks so much. I'm Crystal Carson. I'm the Director of PR and Communications at Psygen. And for those that aren't familiar with Psygen, we're building the first dedicated psychedelic manufacturing facility in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. We'll be producing 8 compounds that will be going to market once we have our dealer license. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce my team. I have with me Nadia Vanderhagen. She is the Director of Sales and Marketing, and she comes to us from a background in critical care. So she's taken a lot of her understanding from the medical system and brought a new approach to our customer relationship approach and package, and how we will be dealing with our clients and future customers. And then I have David, who has recently joined our team after leaving a large law firm here in Canada. He is now our Chief Legal Officer. He is also a patent agent and has his PhD in structural biochemistry. And last but not least, our co-founder, Danny, who founded the company with Peter Vanderhagen, and he has a background and education in chemistry, but he is now dedicated to providing access to these medicines for both medical and therapeutic use. Now, without further ado, I think we want to get right back to the point of talking about the psychedelic supply chain and the good, the bad, and the reality of what that looks like in the current market conditions. So I'd love to hear from you, Danny, as a founder. Obviously, you saw an opportunity in the market, you saw a miss in the market. I'd love to hear from you, your insights as to what's really going on right now.
Yeah, so from my perspective, what I'm seeing is an explosion in interest in psychedelic, or an interest in psychedelic therapies, both from a medical context, but also from kind of an accessibility perspective in Canada. We're seeing so much growth in the clinical trial space. There's over 124 active, or it's 114 active trials in North America, and I think 24 in Europe. And so, you know, when we were starting Psygen back in 2018, and there was still, you know, I think psychedelics in a large way were still stigmatized to where we are today. It's just staggering in a way that there's so much mainstream attention on psychedelics now. But I think that I'd be very curious for Nadia's perspective on, you know, what trends that she's seeing in terms of requirements and the demand that's increasing for these molecules.
Yeah, thanks, Danny, for sure. Yeah, so you know, in terms of current market conditions, coming from my point of view, which is from I guess you can say a sales point of view, we are looking forward. You know, once we have our dealer's license in place, we will be kind of activating the sales program that I've been working on. But in the meantime, I've been building relationships with lots of groups in the space. So just some context. What I found so far, there's essentially 3 types of customers trying to access psychedelics right now. There's your drug development companies or for-profit companies. They're looking to bring a drug through the full drug approval pathway and clinical trials and hopefully gain market authorization. That is a majority of the customers that I speak to right now. I also work with some groups that are nonprofit organizations, or they're wanting to provide access for compassionate use or under special access programs. There's a couple international groups doing that as well. And those are really great to work with because we are very excited to, you know, offer the material at a discount or at cost so that they can provide this to patients that need it the most and as soon as possible. And then the third group we work with on a fairly regular basis are academic researchers. These are people who are just looking to publish a study. They're not looking to turn a profit in the end. They just want to do research, finish their thesis, and so on. These are fantastic groups and academics to work with because they're providing and publishing publicly the information that they learn. And I think that helps drive the whole industry forward. So from what I'm seeing, most of the research that people are doing right now is still in the preclinical or phase 1 phase. So although there seems to be like a large number, as Danny said, organizations with ongoing programs, there's a lot of press releases about ideas and future plans. Most of the material today or in the future at the end of the year or early next year is going to be in smaller volumes. So there's still looking in the 5 to 50 gram amounts that we totally anticipate as the organizations move through their clinical trials, larger patient numbers and so on, we'll see kind of start seeing larger amounts being ordered. So that's about how the market looks to me right now.
And you bring up a good point about the different types of organizations that are out there. I know that one of the issues that we talked about when we were planning this was bottlenecks in the supply chain and exclusivity agreements and some of the organizations that are caught in that, creating scarcity. I'd love to just get a bit of a philosophy and an understanding, I guess, from Danny's perspective as to why Psygen's gone non-exclusive with supplying the industry.
Yeah, so certainly from what we understand, there's a lot of contract manufacturers that are tied up in exclusive arrangements with drug development companies. And something that has always been kind of at the core of Psygen's ethos is that we want to improve access to psychedelics and psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. So something that is really core to our belief and our strategy is to provide access to the classical psychedelics on a non-exclusive basis so that we can help support and foster an ecosystem that encourages research, encourages access, and ultimately will lead to the most patients having access to these medicines.
And I think anyone who, has worked in the drug approval or a clinical trial process, an interruption in the supply chain can be, a really detrimental to the healing process and grind your research to a halt. So by continuing to offer non-exclusivity, it's not like we're one day going to sign an exclusivity agreement and cut everyone else out. So they can be, assured that in moving into the future, they are still going to have access as long as they're licensed to receive it.
And so you guys have mentioned some numbers that right now everything is in rather small proportions and will be scaling up. Where do we see that scalability coming from? Like how do you solve that issue? Because I think, as you noted, it's North America and Europe are in clinical trials. Australia, it's become a global industry quite quickly. How do you solve the scalability problem? And what are your perspectives on that?
Yeah, so certainly, the demand for clinical research material is relatively small, but as soon as you start to consider a market authorization, the disease population for so many of these mental health indications are in the millions, tens of millions of individuals, and to treat 1 million persons with, a psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy program, which is typically 3 active dosage sessions and 20 to 25 milligram doses, 100 kilos of psilocybin is actually what would be required for that 1 million person market. So, I think that you can see that the demand for these compounds is going to scale extremely rapidly. And there's still room for access to be improved outside of the kind of, the drug approval pathway and waiting for a market authorized product. And I'd be curious for David's perspective on kind of some of the potential regulatory changes that could come down the pipe that would result in this improved access.
Yeah, no, happy to. So, and I'm speaking from a Canadian perspective. This would have its own version in the US. And it's important to remember that in the United States, criminal law is governed at the state level. So you can have the death penalty in one state, but not the other. You can have regulated cannabis in one state, but not the other. You can have regulated psilocybin industry in Oregon, but not in other states. In Canada, that's inverted, which makes sense. We're 10% the population of the United States. So it's easier to govern a smaller number of people with a uniform set of criminal laws, which means in Canada, if there's going to be any sort of access to psilocybin or any other psychedelic outside of the prescription drug system, similar to what we had prior to the Cannabis Act and currently have still with cannabis, that would have to be at the federal level. So, and that's not something that I think it's wise to count on happening. And at Psygen, we're really aimed at succeeding with 0 changes in the law. So if the thing that I think will happen almost with certainty, I mean, you see MAPS Public Benefit Corporation very close to the finish line here with MDMA and at least 2 companies with psilocybin. I think we're going to see prescription drugs, and inside of 5 years, probably maybe even inside of 2 years with MDMA. So that's what's going to happen with certainty, is there will be prescription drugs where psychedelics are the active pharmaceutical ingredient. Whether or not Canada sets up a federal medical access system, and if it does, what that looks like, and one would assume it would look a bit like cannabis. I mean, maybe with different access rules, since the substances psilocybin and cannabis are used quite differently by patients. You know, if that happened, I'm not sure what it would look like, but if it did, we would certainly be a company that would be well positioned to supply that market, because I think unlike cannabis, with psychedelics, the market for a pure compound is probably a bigger piece of the overall market compared to botanicals like psilocybin mushrooms or ayahuasca or cacti with mescaline or many, many other plants that include multiple psychedelics, usually exemplified by one compound that we understand better than the rest. I think with psychedelics, the utility and the attractiveness of pure compounds is much greater than it was with THC. So to answer your question about what it might look like, I mean, the blueprint we have here in Canada is medical cannabis access, which is on a doctor's recommendation, but the products they're recommending, which can vary widely, are not indicated for any particular health indication. And I could see psilocybin mushrooms and maybe other psychedelics, but most likely psilocybin, whether it's in a dried fruiting body or in a pure compound that's synthetic or otherwise produced, I think would be politically possible, but I'm not counting on it.
Interesting. Yes, and so we often, I mean, we hear a lot in the news constantly. Even when I was looking up research and doing a bit of research about the supply chain in general and the different medicines, there's so much news coming out about MDMA and psilocybin. There's a lot of other psychedelic medicines that do help these different indications. And we are producing 8 different compounds with more potentially in the future. I'm just curious what your thoughts are. Nadia, I'd love to get this actually, I'd love to talk to you about this. Like, what medicines are you seeing in these conversations? Like, are you seeing outside of just what we're seeing in the news? So is it outside of just the MDMA and the psilocybin conversation that's everywhere? Are you hearing from an industry perspective that there's interest in other compounds and other methodologies and other medicines? And what does that look like from insider's perspective, I guess you could say?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have a really, I guess when you say it like that, I realize I have a really unique perspective in that I have all these relationships I've built with different companies. So I do kind of have the insider scoop that they may not have press release yet about what they're doing. So, just to, I guess, clarify that the 8 compounds that we're going to be working with are or hopefully supplying is psilocybin, DMT, MDMA, LSD, 2CB, mescaline, 5-MeO-DMT, and ibogaine. Is that right? Did I miss any? Danny, you got it? Okay, good. I always go down that list and I feel like I forgot something. But basically, what is in most demand is it does kind of follow what the press releases are saying. I think that is fairly accurate. I think we can all safely say synthetic psilocybin is the belle of the ball right now, and everyone is very interested in it. It's in high demand. I'm trying to wrap my head around like why that is. I'm almost wondering if it's because like magic mushrooms there's maybe less stigma around it than LSD or DMT. People know more about it, therefore it's just the one that we think maybe society will accept openly first, and then hopefully that will lead the way to the other ones. So majority of the customers I talk to are interested in synthetic psilocybin and a variety of indications for that. Second in demand, I would say is likely DMT. There's some really interesting studies going on with that. Some that I'm so excited about, but due to my NDAs, I can't talk about them, but they're very, very exciting. And then third would probably be, I think MDMA and LSD are quite, in line for that. There's certainly some interest in that. And then, in Canada, 5-MeO-DMT and ibogaine are not controlled. So we do have some interested groups in Canada in those substances that we've been working with. So there are outliers maybe with 2CB. There's some interested groups in mescaline in terms of peyote protection and so on. So there's a couple really neat projects. I don't know, Danny or David, you want to add to that? What you think? Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I think the only other thing that I would add is that there's a lot of interest in, I guess, second-gen psychedelics, deuterated psychedelics, and I think that while I do not want to discount the potential utility of these substances. I think it's really important to just keep in perspective the amount of safety and efficacy data, where a lot of the efficacy is anecdotal at this point, but there's so much safety data associated with the use of LSD, psilocybin, and MDMA, that the path to bring those drugs to market is going to be so much faster than these second-gen psychedelics, which will really require a lot of additional preclinical work before we can validate their safety.
And I think a real market for a company like Psygen is also kind of groups that are doing research, maybe in some cases more on just the nature of consciousness and how the brain works. There's a lot of different phenethylamine or tryptamine drugs that do different things and bind differently. And there's structural correlations you can make between the structure of the molecule. I mean, there's rational predictions you can make on what will be psychoactive or not. And that psychoactivity is related to receptor binding. And I think as just in general, people get more sophisticated in how we're looking at neurochemistry, I think there's a true market for research chemicals that will be used to investigate how the brain works. And because we're so focused on just a narrow group of structures, we're well positioned to provide kind of smaller batch custom molecules when that's what people need.
That's great. With the Psygen approach, it's all synthetic. And, Dave, you've brought up points about what needs to happen within the legal system. I'm curious from, I guess, an operational standpoint, Danny, when you were founding the company, why, given your open mind to all medicines and all of the work that they do and healing that they could potentially do, why you chose to go 100% synthetic with Psygen as a founder?
Yeah, so I mean, from the founder's perspective, it's really because my core interest is in LSD, and LSD does not have a natural source. So, when it comes to something like psilocybin, you're looking at the drug development path and trying to consider taking a natural product, doing, arguably complex extraction, isolation, and purification to result in kind of a GMP quality API. It's just a lot easier to have a repeated quality and consistency when you're doing chemical synthesis. Which is not to say, I do believe that there will be natural products that will come to market, and it could be through the drug approval pathway, similar to how GW Pharma, has marketed Epidiolex. But I think that it's just quite a lot simpler when you're dealing with single compound APIs. And so that was really the core intention behind Psygen's synthetic manufacturing process, is just the ultimate control for quality. And I think it's an interesting, Nadia, you were talking about how psilocybin is likely the compound that has the most demand right now because it's a natural product and it's kind of following from the cannabis industry. And I think there's a lot of comparisons between, the emerging psilocybin industry or psychedelics industry and what we've seen in cannabis. I just think that there's where the entourage effect has been so important in cannabis. A lot of the clinical evidence is demonstrating that psilocybin as the pure synthetic API is responsible for this really profound efficacy that we're seeing over conventional antidepressants. And that is not to say that there is not an importance for the entourage effect in psilocybin mushrooms. There very well may be certain strains or certain blends of tryptamines in mushrooms that can produce a novel effect, but it's just not necessary for the efficacy to treat depression and anxiety that we observed in cannabis with THC.
And I think I'd add that where you do have combinations like with ayahuasca that are very effective as botanical preparations, I don't want to this comment might alienate some people, but in a lot of cases you can figure out what kind of 2 or 3 molecules are responsible for the majority of that effect. And then while you might not get quite the same experience that kind of the best and most familiar people in the world have with working with the plants, you probably make something that can be predictably delivered on a bigger scale and predictably give, a certain bandwidth of benefits that is realistic to scale. And I really think we'll see that with synthetic drugs, even where we're sort of following a lead of something that comes from nature, like with psilocybin or mescaline or even salvinorin A.
It's interesting too, from a relationship standpoint from groups. A lot of groups kind of are very in early stages, and they're seeking. They haven't even necessarily decided yet. They know what they want to work with psilocybin, but they haven't decided if they want to go synthetic or a natural extract route. And many of them have come to the conclusion, and maybe I'm a little biased, or maybe I'm just very good at my sales job, but they came to the conclusion that synthetic would be the path of least resistance to regulatory approval, and they've kind of switched because of this snapshot in time. If they truly want to move forward now and not a couple of years from now, they chose to go the synthetic route. So.
And I'm curious as well, as much as we're having this supply chain conversation amongst the industry, what are we saying from destigmatization and actually seeing what patients are wanting, and is that correlating to industry demand right now? Are we actually seeing, our potential customers or industry members actually having any perception of what their potential patients would want? Is that something that's being taken into consideration right now, or is it truly coming from a supply chain and availability and regulatory standpoint?
So I don't have a lot to say on this topic, but I will say that there have been amazing patient advocacy efforts on behalf of the likes of Therasil and some other groups in Canada. I think Therasil is the most notorious, or notable rather, and they are just advocating on behalf of whatever the patient wants. And most of the exemptions that they've received from Health Canada to date have been with psilocybe mushrooms, the fruiting bodies of the mushroom. But I know that there have been some patients who have not had the healing benefits from their psilocybe mushroom experience, and those patients are now looking to access a synthetic product. So at the end of the day, I think that there will be important implications or considerations for patient needs when you're considering supply chains. But in drug development, I think that most drug developers are kind of tending towards synthetic products versus natural.
And that itself might help reduce stigma, because I think people find it easier to trust, a pure compound that is dosed accurately. When I say people, I mean definitely physicians and a lot of patients. I think with the patients, it's divided. Like some people, they identify with the idea of taking a botanical source, like a dried fruiting body of a mushroom. But and we got to remember that we're not killing tumors here or wiping out an infection. We're supporting psychotherapy. So the patient's perception of the medicine, the patient's perception of their relationship with the medicine, I have to think will affect the outcome of the therapy. So, and that's why I'm very happy, and speaking about stigma, that Health Canada has allowed exemptions to possess psilocybin and consume psilocybin, not only for patients who need therapy, but also for the healthcare practitioners, physicians, nurse practitioners, psychologists, social workers, many other, probably about 5 different types of healthcare practitioners now that have been, in specific cases, given permission by the government to possess psilocybin, to use it. And then when they speak with their patients, they can say, I have done this. I've done it under circumstances that were not illicit. Here's what you can expect. Here's where it's going to take you. Here's what here's what I found difficult. They can have that conversation in an open way, because I think for a lot of people who want to be out and loud and proud about psychedelics, that's fine. But when you're a doctor or a healthcare practitioner, like a psychologist, and you have professional obligations, you can lose your license if you don't comply with those professional obligations. And a cavalier attitude towards using controlled substances can lean in that direction, especially when you involve it in your patient's care. But with these few practitioners who've been given permission by Health Canada, again, it's Canada, it's the federal government, it's not a provincial government, giving them permission to possess, I think that itself is going to lower stigma, especially when we remember that a lot of these patients have either never used psychedelics, or it's been a very long time and they use them in very different circumstances. So a lot of these people, most of whom are terminally ill, are walking into something with a lot of apprehension and uncertainty. So I think it's maybe in this room easy to forget that, in people that are interested in the topic. But I think that will also go a long way towards lowering stigma. And we live in a country where cannabis is legal. I can buy this. This is a consumer packaged good. I bought it next door to a gas station. It's boring and mundane and non-controversial. And I think it's very easy to underestimate the impact of federally regulated cannabis on destigmatizing controlled substances in general.
Yeah, I think further to that point about destigmatization, I think that the whole Right to Die campaign or the Right to Try campaign is doing some really interesting things in the same way that the Charlotte's Web CBD movement destigmatized cannabis. Because when I was first involved in the cannabis industry, I've always had my sights set on psychedelics. Cannabis was kind of a stepping stone to get here, while psychedelics were becoming destigmatized. And for my grandparents, when I went into this this cannabis space, they were quite alarmed. And the one thing that really kind of helped to get them on board with this idea that cannabis is a medicine was the application of CBD for children with epilepsy. And so I think that when you have someone who is suffering from some condition and they're at the end of all their options and they're actually looking for doctor-assisted suicide, and now they have this right to try psychedelic therapy to maybe get some perspective and help them achieve a comfort in the last kind of stages of their life, then that alone might help to destigmatize the use of psychedelics for certain purposes. And of course, MAPS with their PTSD for Veteran program has done, I think that that's another really exceptional case study of how this population in the United States that has done something so honorable for their country that then come back and they're absolutely ravaged with trauma. The fact that MAPS can now provide this therapy that actually works is, another step towards destigmatizing psychedelic use.
Fantastic. Now, I have a question from the audience that I'd like to bring forward, and that is, how are you navigating consideration for the Indigenous communities when it comes to supply chain for psychedelics?
Yeah, so I can answer this briefly, and then I'd be curious for Nadia and David's perspective. When we were first kind of looking at what compounds to include under our license and for our application, mescaline is a bit of a weird one because it's got a very long activity and it's got, it's a very large dose relative to the other psychedelics. And our interest with mescaline was really more from a conservation perspective, and we were hoping to find an Indigenous group that wanted to engage in a development program to use mescaline and ideally a synthetic source of mescaline in their, in their natural practices, so that they can have a source material that is not dependent on kind of harvesting cacti from nature and kind of, adding to the pressure that is already on an endangered organism. And it's also really interesting. There are in Canada, I don't even know what you call it, but I guess the freedom to operate for Indigenous communities means that there may actually be an opportunity for Indigenous leaders to start offering psychedelic therapies outside of even a medical access framework within Canada, because the federal government doesn't really have a jurisdiction. And so, that's something, I don't know what the implications of what supply would look like into those programs if a federally regulated supplier would be able to sell into Indigenous programs. That's something that's just outside of my understanding of the regulations. But
and one, it would generally depend on how they're exercising their sovereignty. If a First Nation, under treaties in Canada and under Canadian legislation, very unfortunately named the Indian Act, is the way that kind of works. And I'm not an expert on this area, but in broad strokes, First Nations have the right to govern themselves how they see fit within certain limits. And cannabis is a great example of that, because you have fully functioning industries on First Nations that are separate from each other, that have cultivation, processing, they make concentrate homes, they have analytical testing, they have packaging rules. And as long as they govern themselves in a manner that works for them, they're within their rights. And with psychedelics, there's a few different bases upon which they could argue for that right. And a lot of it would relate to traditional use, pre-contact use, pre-treaty use, which would certainly apply to psilocybin mushrooms. I believe it applies to mescaline, but that might be after European contact. And again, I'm not really an expert on what the requirement is for them to be able to, but it is true that with cannabis, the federally regulated system in Canada cannot really exchange products with a First Nations regulated system. So it would really depend how they did it. If it was done in a way that was under federally issued authorizations, then we would, as long as the authorization allowed Psygen to do it, we would be able to sell to them. But if it was a First Nation that just decides to take matters into its own hands, which they're entitled to do, then I would say conservatively likely not. But time will tell.
And I think from a sales perspective too, really quickly, is just my commitment is to reduce barriers to these groups that will inevitably want to access this, I hope, in the future. I'm willing to put in the labor to help support that. And when I talk to a group, I don't just say, here's our, price list and here's what we do. We have a discussion and we build a relationship. And I really want to get deep into what exactly you're doing and what is the end reason for this material. And so I wish I could say the price was the same for everyone, but it's a little bit different because, like I said, we work with nonprofits and special access groups, and as well as Indigenous groups. We would really reduce the barriers in terms of cost to access these materials, whether it's at cost, below cost, or even fully donated for some of these groups. It's a discussion we'll have, and we're always open to that.
I have another question from the crowd, you guys. They asked, could you please speak to your manufacturing process and specific certifications that you have in place at your facility?
Yeah, so with respect to manufacturing processes, it's been through partnership with a company at the University of Alberta, Applied Pharmaceutical Innovation. We had access to start developing some synthetic protocols. A lot of them are following, I guess, published methods that are well known, but we've made some improvements on. So we're in the process of filing provisional IP on some of these improvements. And with respect to specific certifications that we have in place at our facility, technically, the facility is still under construction. In order to manufacture a GMP product in Canada, that process is controlled by the establishment licensing process. So once we have a dealer's license and we're authorized to manufacture restricted substances or controlled substances, we have to validate our process, all of our equipment, and at that point we can then apply for an establishment license. Health Canada would then come in, they would inspect all of our records under our quality management system, and the result of that audit would be an establishment license, which is kind of that GMP check mark from Health Canada, which is really only necessary for phase 3 and market authorized drug products. For preclinical, for phase 1 and phase 2, there are guidelines that Health Canada has published that APIs that are manufactured for clinical research need to follow, but you don't need an establishment license in order to supply APIs into those clinical trial markets.
That's great. Well, I think we are getting to the end of our session here. We haven't received any more questions in. So is there anything else that we just...
Crystal, I saw one question a little further up. I think it was up on the screen here. Danny kind of spoke to the right to try, but just if anyone was interested on how just a quick blurb, we will be able to export material. It's all controlled by Health Canada and their regulators. So for example, to bring material to the US, it would be someone who would have a Schedule 1 license. They would apply, I believe it's to the DEA, for an import permit. We then receive we take it and we apply for an export permit with Health Canada, and then we essentially ship it. So it, sounds very simple. There's a lot of paperwork, compliance, rules, regulations. But yeah, if that kind of answers your question, we will be able to supply to the US. We will be able to supply to international customers as well. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you guys. We're just about at time, but that was a really, really thorough and thoughtful conversation, and we appreciate all your details you added to the audience questions as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Excellent.
Margaret.
For our audience, please click leave on this session and provide your feedback as you go, and then go to the agenda to click to join the next session. Thanks again, everyone.